why we are here 38 days after the war began. The invasion of Kuwait and Iraq has begun all across a broad front. As best we can tell, the coalition forces, the Allied coalition forces, have been pushing slowly and cautiously, we're told in some cases, very swiftly in others, into occupied Kuwait, into the Kuwait theater of operation in general, which means Iraq is also being invaded on the land and in the air at the very least. There may as well be amphibious operations going. We are not sure of that as yet, though in about 45 minutes from now there's going to be the first briefing at the Pentagon since the land war began. In about 14 minutes, President Bush is going to be speaking to the nation. He has returned just a few minutes ago from Camp David, where he has spent the weekend. All of the Allied coalition forces are in the next several hours announcing to their peoples, though it's the middle of the night in some places, that this crucial new page has been turned and that the land war has begun. This results, of course, because today at 12 Eastern Time in the evening, 8 o'clock in the evening in the Middle East, President Saddam Hussein virtually ignored President Bush's ultimatum that he had to begin a massive withdrawal of his troops from Kuwait, and in 48 hours he had to evacuate Kuwait City. All of the political negotiations that went on over the last several days between the Soviets and the Iraqis are now moot, and nothing has come of them. There's been a long day, as John McCarthy told us a short while ago, between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. All of that has now been put aside for the beginning of the inevitable land war. I say inevitable because over the last several days it was the widespread view that it was inevitable all the way from the president on down. We have a number of people on station around the world. What we will try to talk about now for a few minutes, in I hope very elementary language from our military analysts, is the air-land battle. Tony Cordesman, the air-land battle is something we have been talking about from several days in very simple language. Does it mean we send in helicopters, the U.S. forces send in helicopters and go in on the ground as well, or is it a coordinated thing?
It is a coordinated thing, and it is very coordinated, because it not only is a matter of using air and land together, it is using several different methods of attack at once. So we would want to have an amphibious attack at virtually the same time we penetrated the forward area in Kuwait, that we launched an envelopment to the west of Kuwait and perhaps tried to bypass it. And it's not just helicopters, although those are a critical component. We'd be bringing in rockets, like the multiple launch rocket system or the JTACMs.
Stop for a second. The multiple launch rocket system. Useful for what? What distance? What are its targets? I think we actually even have some video of it. While you're talking, we'll show it if we can find it. Go ahead.
Peter, it can fire in excess of 40 kilometers. Each rocket can drop minelets that can cover an area the size of a football field and virtually halt any kind of military action. The bomblets can kill both personnel and armor. The JTACM's range is classified, but it can go even further. And these area weapons can attack Iraqi forces the moment they move.
So there is no real close engagement at the moment. Those are the multiple launch rocket systems we are looking at on the camera. So you're still fighting the enemy at some considerable distance, right?
Wherever you can in the air-land battle, you want to bypass the enemy and strike him at ranges beyond line of sight. You can do this with aircraft like the A-10, the F-15E, with helicopters like the Apache or the Cobra, with weapons like this, which have a devastating impact when they land. When we do get to close ranges, as General Trainer has pointed out, and it's a critical point, sooner or later you do get to close ranges, then we have the advantage in terms of tank range and also artillery targeting.
Stop for a second, Tony. I want to stay with something you brought up just a moment ago, which was helicopters. When you refer to the 1st Air Cavalry, for example, these days, you were referring, obviously, that the helicopter, which really came into its own in the Vietnam War, is now being used in an even wider way, isn't it?
Much more widely. Actually, anyone who served in Vietnam has no idea at all of how modern air cavalry works. It's a mixture of assault helicopters carrying troops with anti-tank guided weapons, with relatively heavy infantry weapons, plus attack helicopters which can kill tanks at ranges of 4 kilometers. And as we see the Apache on the screen, that has not only the Hellfire, but cannon and rockets.
What's the Hellfire?
The Hellfire is a system which can kill at ranges in excess of 4 kilometers. Once you targeted it, it is a fire-and-forget weapon. You don't have to guide it exactly to the target.
What does it go after, heat source?
It goes, well, actually, it goes after whatever you targeted it on, Peter,
Right.
because you can use a number of different sighting mechanisms. It is probably the most lethal single anti-tank weapon in our inventory, except for some versions of the Maverick, which is an air-launched missile.
So what you have now is you have tanks and armored personnel carriers and the Bradley fighting vehicles moving on the ground, carrying the infantry. Mm-hmm. The infantry walking behind the tanks in any way, shape, or form as they did in all the World War II movies?
I'm sure our infantry has not forgotten how to walk, Peter, but it moves inside the Bradleys, inside another system called the M113. Mm-hmm. It is much heavier in terms of firepower. It carries anti-tank weapons like the TOW. It carries relatively heavy ordnance. The actual vehicles are equipped with cannon. So, and I don't mean heavy cannon, but often 25 millimeter or similar weapons which can destroy the Iraqi light armored vehicles. And it can move at very fast speeds. And if you look at the TOW, we do have some problems. The Dragon perhaps is not the weapon, it's a hand-carried weapon, but no one doubts what the TOW can do, and there is an improved version in a TOW 2 which can destroy any of the T-72s.
I promised people, Tony, that we'd be very elementary, and they may have heard it before, but a TOW missile is an anti-tank missile in the main. Tell us how it operates.
What the operator does, it's a third-generation weapon, and that doesn't mean too much, except the early weapons were extremely hard to guide to their target. With this weapon, what you do is you just have to keep the sight on the target, and the missile automatically flies to where the target is, and it's
wire-guided, isn't it?
It is a wire-guided weapon, but it also has an infrared link, and this might be a problem, Peter, because the French sold the Iraqis very large numbers of countermeasures to the TOWs because it was in the Iranian inventory.
You know, you raise an interesting point here, which I'd like to come back to in just one second, in terms of how much each side has benefited from the other side's technology. The Allied coalition, of course, is facing in many cases weapons that they sold the Iraqis, as Tony Cortisman pointed out. But I'd like to go along a little farther with the Apache, because Sam Donaldson, who is in Saudi Arabia, has been spending a lot of time studying about, traveling about, and talking to men and their machines. Sam, pick it up on that, would you?
Well, Peter, Tony spoke so admiringly of the Apache, and properly so. We're going to show you some Apaches in combat about a week ago. They're from the 11th Aviation Brigade. You're looking at them at night. Video cameras mounted with night scopes. Those are the 20-millimeter cannon. I think you're going to see a couple of Hellfire missiles fired. They're attacking a Iraqi installation inside Kuwait. And as Tony said, they're standing off at a great distance. The scope finds the target, and that was a Hellfire missile. These Apaches have been used certainly tonight, I feel certain. They're all up and down the border, and they're devastating, really. Okay. They're real tank killers.
Very devastating, too. The Hellfire is about a $500,000, $500,000 missile. You could go on forever about how much things cost and how much it costs to kill things with certain things. Kill being this military lingo we pick up and use with such sterility in many cases these days. But one U.S. commander was relieved of his command this week because he was the one who, leading an Apache, fired in the dark on what he thought was an Iraqi target, and of course hit Americans instead, and another handful of Americans were killed by friendly fire. And as a result of that, giving you some impression that accuracy is not always what people think it is, that there is human error. It was Americans who died in that case, not the Iraqis. Tony, come back and talk a little bit more. In fact, let me jump on to General Traynor for a second in Boston. General Traynor, we're talking about the air-land battle. At the time that the infantry and the mechanized brigades are moving along the ground, other forces, of course, are trying to jump over or bypass the Iraqis' initial defenses and get in behind them. How do they do that?
Let me first correct a misimpression that may have been left with the viewers. The 1st Cavalry Division of the U.S. Army is not a helicopter organization.
It's an armored division, right?
It's an armored division. The helicopter division of the U.S. Army, and it's in Saudi Arabia, is the 101st Air Assault Division. But now getting to your question,
That's the journalist in your general trainer, right?
Yeah.
I should say general trainer who was a Marine general, then went on to become a journalist, so he's doubly potent in this regard, sir. Go ahead.
The way the U.S. forces like to fight is in what they call a combined arms operation. And by that, I mean they make use of tanks, infantry, artillery, helicopters, and fixed-wing aviation, putting it together an amalgam to bring firepower and maneuver against an enemy. So you have your artillery firing at the enemy, your air coming down and attacking him both with helicopters and with fixed-wing aircraft, and then you have your armored forces and your infantry forces in armored vehicles moving against the enemy. So you put this whole combination together in the battlefront. In addition to that, you can put your helicopter forces well deep into the enemy's support area. And normally what you try to do is go after critical locations that become intolerable to the enemy. For example, crossroads, where if the enemy is going to try to reinforce or withdraw, you have him blocked. So you put this sort of combination together with an exquisite command and control process, which depends upon modern technology, computers, as well as radios. And you, generally speaking, try to stay one step ahead of your enemy so that he has great difficulty in reacting to whatever you're doing, and when he does react, he's probably a little too late in doing so.
You talk as if this has been done before. Has this ever been used before by the United States?
Not in combat. You've had bits and pieces of this sort of thing done in Vietnam, where the thing tended to mature, but most of all, it was designed to fight a defensive battle in Europe, and it was practiced out mostly at Fort Irwin in California by the Army, which just incidentally happens to be a desert. But the whole approach was fundamentally a defensive type of operation against the Warsaw Pact attack in NATO, but it obviously has offensive application.
Just one more question for you now, General Trainer. By the way, I think we also need to get your microphone mixer. Perhaps it's only my ear, but it seems to be crackling. You were talking, and Sam Donaldson was talking earlier, about something called the 7th Corps. Now, we have a graphic of everything that's in the 7th Corps. Tell us what the Corps is and what it's made up of.
Well, I assume that your composition is correct. I don't know that for a fact. Okay. Okay, a Corps is simply a headquarters organization. It's commanded by a 3-star general. And by definition, a Corps is an organization that is made up of 2 or more divisions, whether the divisions are infantry divisions or whether they are armored divisions, doesn't make any difference. So the 7th Corps that you're showing on the display would be the heaviest corps that we have in Saudi Arabia. There are other corps. There is the 18th Airborne Corps, which tends to be a lighter corps, which has airborne, air assault, and mechanized infantry divisions in it.
I think it sounds to me a little bit like something we should come back and talk at a little more length than we have now. And I only cut away from you now because in about 40 seconds from now, the President is going to come out and make what we're told is a very short statement to the nation, 2 or 3 minutes. He's not going to take any questions, and then he's going to retire for the night. But then in about half an hour from now, the Pentagon is going to hold a briefing, and the Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, who we've not seen tonight, interestingly, is going to be the actual Pentagon briefer in this case. The President's staff, his personal national security staff, has been in the White House all evening, but as you saw a short while ago, the President came back from Camp David, where he had gone for the weekend. There was even some question at one point a little earlier today whether or not he would come back, but here he is.
Good evening. Yesterday, after conferring with my senior national security advisors and following extensive consultations with our coalition partners, Saddam Hussein was given one last chance, set forth in very explicit terms to do what he should have done more than 6 months ago: withdraw from Kuwait without condition or further delay, and comply fully with the resolutions passed by the United Nations Security Council. Regrettably, the noon deadline passed without the agreement of the government of Iraq to meet demands of United Nations Security Council Resolution 660, as set forth in the specific terms spelled out by the coalition, to withdraw unconditionally from Kuwait. To the contrary, what we have seen is a redoubling of Saddam Hussein's efforts to destroy completely Kuwait and its people. I have therefore directed General Norman Schwarzkopf, in conjunction with coalition forces, to use all forces available, including ground forces, to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait. Once again, this was a decision made only after extensive consultations within our coalition partnership. The liberation of Kuwait has now entered a final phase. I have complete confidence in the ability of the coalition forces swiftly and decisively to accomplish their mission. Tonight, as this coalition of countries seeks to do that which is right and just, I ask only that all of you stop what you were doing and say a prayer for all the coalition forces, and especially for our men and women in uniform, who this very moment are risking their lives for their country and for all of us. May God bless and protect each and every one of them, and may God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much.
Well, we did not anticipate the president was going to stay any longer, and he has made it clear in the past that the war began 38 days ago, to be specific, 38 days and about 2 hours ago, and that this is a new phase in the war only, though, as the president said, the final phase of the liberation of Kuwait. He said that he expected it to be accomplished swiftly and decisively, and that he was confident. The swiftly and decisively may or may not be some indication of the level of confidence which the U.S. High Command, both military and political, has in the present situation on the ground. A little after 6 o'clock in the morning in Baghdad, the war in its fullest sense has now been underway for several hours, and first light has arrived in the Middle East, and so Iraqi and American forces are now engaging one another in the light of day. At the White House now, perhaps with some sense of the president's mood, our White House correspondent Britt Hume. Yes, Britt.
Well, Peter, I was just going to remark that you're quite correct that his presentation here reflected a high degree of confidence that this could be brought about rather quickly. However, I think you'll probably agree that his mood and his tone reflected a certain gravity. He looked more grave to me than I've seen him in any announcement in this room, or indeed any of the announcements he's made on television.
Well, of course, Britt, this is the beginning of that phase of the campaign in which there's no question that it isn't American technology alone which can win the day. There's no standing off any longer, is there, in simply using air power. That may make an enormous difference to the president.
That's right, Peter, and the imponderable in this has always been how hard the Iraqis would fight. It is something that there is really no way of knowing. The President's National Security Advisor, General Scowcroft, told a group of us not so many weeks ago when we were asking the question of how long this would take. He said, we really don't know. It depends on how hard they fight, and we won't know that perhaps for days.
Britt, but a lot of other people have said that the president's not going to settle for anything less than the total humiliation of Saddam Hussein. Are you convinced that that's precisely his thinking?
I am, Peter, and I'll tell you why. The president believes, and some people may find this fanciful, that he is, with his coalition partners, writing the rules of a new world order in which instruments like the UN Security Council will be feared and respected in the world, and that when collective security is invoked against a dictator or a lawless nation at any time, that there will be reason for someone to take heed.
And I think he feels that if Saddam Hussein is able to slide away from this with any kind of a victory, with a military intact that could threaten the region, that the very wrong signal will have been sent, the very opposite of what he's trying to accomplish.
Okay, Brett, it will not come as any surprise to many people that there are people who, when they hear the phrase the New World Order, instantly think that what the United States has brought to the Middle East, or is in the process of bringing to the Middle East, along with Saddam Hussein's adventure in Kuwait, is a new disorder to the Middle East. No other region of the world is so famous for disorder and instability as is the Middle East. But it will be months and perhaps years before the president and his critics are tested on that particular point. A reaction from John McWethy at the State Department. Yes, John.
Peter, I cannot help but reflect on what he has just said when he says we have had extensive consultations with our various coalition partners, knowing that he and Secretary of State Baker have been up at Camp David this weekend dealing with the Soviets. You can bet that both of those men have been burning the phone wires, trying to make sure that everyone not only is on board, but is fully apprised, has a chance to express their own views. The way both President Bush and James Baker work is to make people feel not only that they are in this with the United States, but they have a say. And I can almost bet you that that is how the last 48 hours have gone, as they have talked to every single coalition partner that has a soldier over there.
Have you detected any wavering? I only raise that, John, at this point because at the beginning, when the president was working the phones so vigorously, was exerting so much time, effort, and influence to get the Security Council unanimity for all of the UN resolutions to expel Saddam Hussein, they had to use considerable inducements in some cases.
In some cases, yes, but most of those where they had to use most of the muscle, the political muscle.
Or financial muscle.
Or financial muscle, right. Those were not the countries that have committed the forces. The main coalition partners in this case have been going in the direction that the United States has been moving since very early in this crisis.
Okay, John, thanks very much. By the way, if we can take a look at the map of the Middle East, or should I say of the Kuwait theater of operations.